Bosses of Reddit, what did your new employee do that made you instantly regret hiring them? She stapled papers in the middle of the page. Like as far as she could reach with the stapler. They were loudly taking a phone call while waiting to be interviewed. Taking a call is not a total deal breaker by itself, but the call was her coaching the friend into getting fired so she could get unemployment. I didn't hire her, but after I left I think someone else did. Couldn't figure out how to log into email with step-by-step directions on the first day. Needed step-by-step directions every day for everything on the computer. Me day 3. Did you double click Outlook icon? Him, oh yeah. Now what do I do? Me, type in your password. Him, what's my password? Me, you picked your password the first day. That's why it's called a password. Only you know it. Him, oh yeah. Proceeds to sit there for 15 minutes doing nothing because he doesn't know his password. I'm usually pretty gentle when I fire someone. He wanted to argue he was computer literate during his termination meeting. You keep using that word. Edit. I ran a call center. Incoming and outgoing calls. Turn on 3 programs. Hit the button and everything works automatically. Pretty simple. We hire a lot of felons because we think society gives them a raw deal when they get out. Turns out some of these guys are felons for a reason and deserve a raw deal. This guy was early to mid 30s. Had been a mortgage broker before getting arrested for killing a neighbor. Turns out he didn't kill his neighbor, at least the state couldn't prove he did, but he still ended up doing 2 years waiting for trial. The other employees refused to help him after the first week because he would ask the same questions every day. The exact same question. He would ask me, and I'd look at the rest of the phone room like, are you kidding me? Is this a prank? This has to be a prank, right? Do you have a condition where you forget everything every night? It took me 3 weeks to got through all the performance improvement plan steps to fire him, but basically I wanted to fire him on day 3. I knew I done goofed. I give out a daily summary of unresolved cases and new cases yet to be answered. I handwrite some notes on it as well. On her second day, she asked why her score went down. Confused, I asked her what she meant. Yesterday I got a 10 over 12, but today only 10/13 the date. I had a new guy to train in my job where we installed TVs and various other electronics in expensive houses. I had a small part in hiring him, and even though he wasn't from our industry, he seemed to have good skills in related fields and seemed to be willing to learn what he needed to. Our first 2 weeks were spent finishing up a really nice theater. House was completely finished, and it was pleasant, easy indoor clean work. Then we moved on to the next job and had to wire the house, which involved crawling through the attic and underneath the floors pulling new wires. I turned to this guy and told him to take these 5 wires down underneath the house and crawl them to the other side. He looked at me like I had 3 heads and said, what? No way. I'm not going under there. I was taken aback. This is a huge part of the job, and he had to have known that when he was hired. After a couple minutes of talking to him, it was clear he had no intention of doing any dirty work. He ended up going out and sitting in the work van pouting. I called our manager, and when we drove back to the office at the end of the day, his final check was waiting for him. He was completely stunned and got really upset, trying to blame me as his trainer for setting him up and making him do stuff that no one would ever want to do. I didn't get to see the final encounter myself, but it became the talk of the company for a while. Apparently he never managed to get it through his head that we all had to do that type of work, and I wasn't singling him out. He blamed me and the company for him losing his job all the way out the door. Apparently he also tried lying to the unemployment office and got shut down hard when my manager explained why he was let go, and he corroborated it, still assuming that we were in the wrong for asking him to do that type of work. A friend of mine works at a construction recruitment agency and recently told me a great story. His colleague got a phone call in the office from a client, the foreman of a large construction site, who immediately began to scream at him to come to the site and collect a laborer from the agency who was on his first day working there. It transpired that this young, chavvy temp had left the tracked excavator he was supposed to be operating to find the foreman and demand a socket set to remove the excavator seat, as he dropped his phone under it and couldn't reach it. The foreman told him to frick off and get back to work, and that he could try to retrieve his phone at the end of the day once he was off the clock. Phones weren't allowed on site anyway. After a shouting match, the laborer stormed off, climbed into the neighboring excavator, and used its bucket to rip the cab off his machine to get to his phone. Needless to say, the agency took him off its books. What's the company policy on fighting? He was totally serious too. When told he can't, he asked what about in the parking lot. I once worked with someone who was an absolute waste of space. My boss said he was going to promote him. I told him not, it's a bad idea. After 3 months of training, the guy became a manager. Then on his first shift alone stole all the cash from the day's sales. I wasn't even mad. I smiled when my boss told me. I hope my former boss doesn't comment about his employee that made 2 espressos when someone asked for a double espresso. I regret being myself, guys, I'm sorry. We hired a bench technician to do electronics repair. The first job I asked his help with was to extend a CARM cable. 3 conductors. Easy peasy. Cut the cable, splice in X amount of new wire, done. He comes back to me an hour later with the original cable, cut in 2, then spliced back together, without adding anything to it. Instead of extending it, all he did was cut it and put it back together. And it took him an hour. Reminds me of a few weeks ago when I had to replace a fan in my 3rd printer. The new one had to short a cable, so I cut the new and old ones, splice them together super neatly with heat shrink and everything, fire it back up, and wonder why the new fan is just as noisy as the old one. Took me a minute to realize I had cut the fan wire and then spliced the same fan wire back together again. Luckily the whole process was about 12 minutes, from start to mistake to redo to finish. Ran an in-home senior care business. Hired a chick, and she got a sweet ass gig. 9 to 5, steady work, great easygoing family and easily cared for elderly lady. All she had to do was wear scrubs, not tank tops and shorty shorts. That's it. 1 week in was when that changed. We also found out that she brought a catalog of stuff to sell to the person she was caring for. Ended up selling her like $500 worth of shoot. Luckily we were able to stop it in time. Only person we ever had to actually fire. Everyone else lost their client or just quit. I didn't directly hire him, but we once had a new employee shadow me since I was the stock manager, and on day 1 he bragged to me about how much coke he had done the night before. The store manager was about 5 feet away, and I simply looked over the new guy's shoulder and shook my head. He was gone soon after. Edit. Didn't expect this to get any attention, so I'll throw in some more context. He wasn't immediately let go because at the time we really needed the seasonal help, but even so it only took a couple shifts of being late and smelling like pot for him to be dealt with. I used to work retail relatively close to a college town, so it's not unusual to have employees hungover, etc. I had just assumed that was the case. Mentioned in small talk that I myself was a little hungover, and he just stops and goes, "Oh dude, let me tell you about this party," and continued on into his extravaganza of a night. Throughout the day he had been making frequent trips to the bathroom and told me it was because his nose kept bleeding. I now knew why. Several months later he came back to reapply for his old job because the store was under new management. I don't think he realized that I was part of that new management, or he had assumed I was just cool with it. I wasn't, dude half-assed his job regardless of the drugs. I also have reason to believe he snuck off on his lunch break to smoke pot. I don't have a problem with it. I'm a bit of a stoner myself, but I just don't bring it to work. On his second day, responded to an email complaint about our customer service. My boss told him to respond to the email. He responded by pretty much telling the customer off without having anyone read or approve of it first. Idiot didn't last very long. Oh my good buddy Simeon. Got hired right out of school for a basic sales job. 2 weeks in most of the offices at a convention. I left the office early to finish off the day from home on me. I'm in tech and could work from home no problem. Should not have left him alone. Day finished out and nothing big happens. Following Monday, security stops me as I'm walking in the building to ask about what we did to this kid after he got caught. Caught doing what? Well, it turns out Simeon decided to take a break after I left for the day. He went and bought a 6-pack and broke onto the roof of the building to drink beers and tan. We are in an 11-story building. On either side of us are 15+ story buildings. Simeon decided to strip down to his underwear and tan on the roof, drinking beers and smoking joints. Security catches him. He blows smoke in the guard's face and tells him to frick off. Gets kicked off the property. Remember, none of us in the office heard anything about this. Simeon was sick and had worked from home the rest of that week. Eventually the building contacts our department, and Simeon is given a warning. He is somehow allowed on the property again and is told he has 2 strikes against him now. He had consistently been showing up over an hour late each day. Next day Simeon shows up at noon for a 9 to 5 job. He calls in first to see if it is okay to come in. He slept through 6 alarms. Manager says sure, come on in. Simeon arrives and is finally fired on the spot. Craziest hire/fire I have ever seen. Entered the clean room without the proper attire, so we had to stop production and bleach about 6 rooms. He was union, so I didn't really have a choice in hiring him, but luckily was able to make sure he was not retained in our department. I feel like right now I'm that new employee. Day 1, relative died, delayed my start by 2 days. Day 5, husband of relative died, was offered compassionate leave. Day 13, girlfriend fell down the stairs and needed to go to hospital. Day 15, I had a pre-booked holiday, another day off. Day 16, GF's passport stolen in another country, missed our train home, weather prevented us traveling that entire day. Day 17, arrived 2 hours late after having to travel across Europe before work. Day 36, boiler explodes during the night and need to sit around for an emergency plumber who then takes all day to fix it. I really swear it's all the bad luck at once, but even I know it sounds so unrealistically far-fetched at this point. I didn't hire them thankfully, but I did work at a call center with a couple that got hired into different divisions. He went to work in sales, and she went into customer service. This isn't all that unusual by itself. What happened next though? Wow. Their plan from the start was to see how quickly each of them could get let go after they'd started their medical benefits, which kicked in around the 90-day mark. So they were both fairly exemplary. During that time, they both began talking to co-workers in their divisions about their off-work time, internet habits, etc. Eventually they started canvassing their respective divisions with business cards advertising their pronoun site and inviting people to join. Apparently they did this pretty frequently, get a job to get medical insurance, then plot to get let go so they could draw unemployment and continue to keep medical insurance going via Cobra. In the meantime, they'd get as many of their doctor and dental visits as they could scheduled. Then, they'd drum up interest in their pronoun campsite, because by then they'd have gotten to know a ton of people. And who doesn't want to see the hot girl/guy at the office having sex? They were both very attractive. Even the managers involved in this clusterfuck of a plan had to admit that the angles on all this were exceptionally slick. And because Phoenix is rife with call centers, they were able to work their way up and down a certain area of town without any of the respective businesses becoming the wiser. He antagonized every single female co-worker. It was like his only way of communicating with anybody of the opposite sex was to be demeaning and constantly using facetious tones to undermine them. Luckily, these weren't the reserved gals he was used to at his private college. He learned this the hard way after making a joke about one of the senior members' lunch being too small and to eat a sandwich. She barked back and he did not return the next day. Asked me permission to use the bathroom every time, in spite of my protestations that he was an adult who I trusted to make his own decisions about going to the lav. He also sent me a weekly spreadsheet of all his breaks, potty and otherwise, lunches, and arrival and departure times. This is in no way required or the norm in our workplace. Finally, after multiple pleas from me, he stopped doing that. He was very smart and very skilled, but this was the first indication that he would otherwise be a lot of work.